Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'll give everyone a couple minutes to come in. I see everyone's starting to come in right now, so we'll get started shortly. All right, looks like we have a pretty good group, so we'll kick things off, and those who are a little bit late can catch up on the recording. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Adria. I'm from the Association of Woodworking and Furnishing Suppliers, and I'm very excited to bring to you the Economic Mid-Year Review with economist Dr. Kuehl. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
A couple housekeeping tips. Please post any questions you have in the chat, and we'll have time for question and answer at the end. And the session is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with you after the session. It'll also be available on our YouTube channel, so you can access it and feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. First, a little plug. I want to make sure that everyone is registered and ready to be at the AWFS Fair next month. It is literally 1 month from now. We will be in Las Vegas, so I really hope you will be there with us. And on Thursday, July 27th at 12 noon, Dr. Kuehl will be presenting on our show floor stage, AWFS Fair Live. It's booth 4780. So if you know our floor plan, remember we're in the West Hall, and that booth is in if you're facing the entrance, it's in the upper right-hand corner. Check the website and check out the floor plan if you want to see where that is, but we really hope you can join us. It's free. His session will be entirely free, and it's open to all registered attendees and exhibitors of the AWFS Fair. There's no separate session registration required. So just come join us and hear Dr. Kuehl's amazing expert advice and information. And then immediately following, there's going to be a panel session with industry experts on our supply chain within our industry and what people are experiencing now. That'll be hosted by Jameson Scott from Air Handling Systems, and it'll feature Bob Brown from Royal Plywood, Jonathan Thompson from EB Bradley, and Paul Wilms from Marine Johnson. So they're going to talk about each of their sectors of the industry: machinery, supplies, hardware, and where, what they're experiencing these days. So anyways, hope you can join us. Moving on, I will briefly introduce Dr. Kuehl. He's the Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. He provides forecast and strategic guidance for a wide variety of corporate clients around the world. He was, prior to starting Armada, a professor of economics and finance for 15 years, and you'll hear he always has amazing information about Russia, which is his passion and interest. He's also the co-author of The Flagship, which I'll mention again at the end of our session, and the Strategic Intelligence System, which are publications of Armada. So Dr. Kuehl, I will stop sharing now and turn it over to you.
Very good. All right. So I'm moving to my exciting screen because, gosh, I have graphs and charts, and, we all know how exciting that can be. So I will confess to you that as I look out the window of my exciting hotel room, I can see the ocean. So I'm in Jacksonville, Florida right now. I will not mention that it's about 106 down here, and humidity is like 900%. So I'm quite content looking at the ocean from my air-conditioned room. Not that I'm a wimp or anything, but hey. So, lots to talk about. Hard even to figure out where to start. Adria has been sending me questions that have been coming from the members, and these are always very pertinent and very oriented towards the industry, so it helps me kind of figure out where to aim things. One of the questions that came up most recently had to do with Russia. And as mentioned in the introduction, back in my tender misspent youth, back in the 1980s, I was training to be a Soviet specialist. I was going to study the evil empire, work for the CIA. I was all set to be a spook. And of course, they went out of business right in the middle of my PhD. So, gee, thanks. I sent a really nasty letter to Gorbachev asking why he couldn't wait a year just to let me finish my defense. But he paid no attention to me. And so there we are. But it has continued to be an issue. So last year, when the Ukraine invasion began, I had to confess that I was kind of half excited because it was like, wow, the Cold War is back and I'm relevant again. So we've been keeping tabs on this. And of course, the last week has been giving us all kinds of new things to worry about, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I begin most of these presentations with this slide because it is truer than I probably would prefer. The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. We are so bad at what it is that we ostensibly do. We are supposed to be forecasters. We're supposed to be predictors. We're supposed to be those individuals who give you accurate advance warning of what is coming. Unfortunately, the economy changes constantly. So we are forever in the debt of meteorologists because they make us look good and they have the same excuses we have, which is more data. We thought we knew what was going on, but then we got more data and that changed our assessment completely. You will hear periodically of economists who confidently predict the mother of all recessions in 2030 or 2035 or the return of the Great Depression in 2040. Given the fact that we can't predict till next Tuesday, what exactly do we think we're doing predicting 8, 9, 10 years from now? Well, the reality is that when you hear that kind of comment from an economist, they are not so much forecasting as they're warning. They're basically saying, look, if you don't deal with some of these issues, you're going to run into problems. If you don't deal with the debt, if you don't deal with the labor shortage, if you don't deal with technology change, if you don't deal with trade disputes, if you don't deal with whatever it is you're not dealing with, well, you're going to have a problem. You're likely to be facing a recession of some kind. So it's less a prediction and more of a heads up, you've got time to change these things, but you have to focus on changing them. And if you don't, well, you get what you get. So don't necessarily mark your calendars that say, hey, I need to go move and live in a yurt by 2030 because the whole world's going to come to an end. We've got opportunities to change should we decide we want to. The other thing we deal with is kind of the crisis du jour attitude. The media has a tendency to get overexcited. And I'm still kind of not sure whether this is because that's just the way the media works. If it bleeds, it leads, or if it's reacting to our demand that we know everything immediately. A lot of what happens in economics or business, it takes a while before the dust settles. You don't really know what you're dealing with until more data comes in. And if you try to start pontificating too early, well, you end up looking silly because then the data comes in and it doesn't support what you were saying earlier. It gives you a whole different conclusion. In the last few weeks, we've been dealing with things, for example, like the debt ceiling. I mean, this was front page news for day after day, week after week. I saw one talking head intoning in a very serious voice, the United States has never faced a situation like this. And I'm like, are you kidding? We have faced this 14 times in the last 20 years. We do this every year. We're the only country in the world that does it this way. Every country deals with the issue of spending and revenue. I mean, the budget is predominant. You have to figure out what you're going to spend. You have to figure out how much money you have. Does it justify what you want to spend? Most countries, most individuals, most businesses, they do this during the budget process. You set a budget based on what you want to accomplish, what you want to spend, and how much money you have coming in, and you try to marry the two. Well, Congress, for whatever reason, doesn't deal with it during the budget process. They don't deal with it during appropriations. after they have budgeted what they can't afford, and after they have appropriated what they can't afford, they then decide if they're going to actually honor the obligations they have committed to, which is ludicrous. And the country never really goes that far. We've come dangerously close in various periods to default and all that. But at the end of the day, nobody wants to grind the entire US economy to a halt. So, surprise, at the last minute, we reached a deal. Who would have imagined? Except whoever has watched us do this 14 times in the last 20 years. So it's kind of a political deal. It's political drama, playing to the base, but it distracts us for weeks at a time. Another one of these crises, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, is the so-called bank crisis. Mostly overblown, but the banks now are looking at more realistic threats, things that they have been somewhat prepared for, or at least have seen before. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. We have the OPEC Saudi Arabia situation, which has not worked out the way the Saudis thought it would. We'll talk a little bit about that too. We are dealing with new technologies, like now it's AI. Everyone is terribly concerned about AI in the same way that they were terribly concerned about robotics 10 years ago. US-China trade, there's a new emerging crisis every day. So just to kind of get the important stuff out of the way, bottom line up front, BLUF. For those who have a short attention span or have other things to do this morning, afternoon, wherever you are, here are the crucial takeaways. Number one, the US economy is not yet hitting stall speed. We are not in recession now. We have been putting it off now for 4 quarters in a row. There were lots and lots of predictions that we would hit recession last year, that we would be in it in third quarter, if not third quarter, fourth quarter for sure, if not fourth quarter, then definitely first quarter, and if not first quarter of this year, then by golly, it's got to be the second. Well, we have not hit recession in any of those quarters, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Pressure is mounting on certain parts of the economy, but one thing to always remember about the US economy is that we rarely, if ever, go into a 100% recession. We rarely, if ever, go into a 100% boom. We're too big an economy. There's always a sector that's doing better than others. There's always a sector that's doing worse. So you're always sort of looking at where the actual damage is being done or where the actual progress is being done. For example, in the industry that you're in, it's something of a dependent industry. It is looking to see what other industries do. It contributes to the housing sector. It contributes to the consumer sector in terms of spending. It contributes to the office building sector, because we're talking a big market for furniture is the office environment. Very few parts of the economy are really in the direct control of people who are in woodworking and furnishing. You're contributing to another sector, so you end up paying a lot of attention to those sectors and whether or not they are expanding or contracting. And often you will find some of your customers doing well and some of your customers not doing so well. Second point, jobs are still strong and consumers are still spending. These are both things that put off recession. We still have a very low unemployment rate, which we'll talk about in a minute. And uncharacteristically, compared to other countries, we're still spending. Retail sales have actually gone up. Very unusual for a culture that is seemingly going into a downturn, and we'll talk about how that works in a minute. Inflation, still too hot. Fed will continue to tighten if this keeps up. But there's always a but. We love buts in economics. There's a lot of conversation about what the ideal inflation number should or can be. What we've been hearing for the last several years is that central banks want to be at 2%. As measured by the personal consumption expenditure reading, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So the notion is that we're not going to be out of the inflation woods until we hit 2%. However, you're now hearing a lot of conversation about, well, maybe 2.5 is close enough. maybe 3 is close enough. In August, and this is something we can kind of anticipate, we'll certainly be thinking about it as we meet in Vegas. There's a very important meeting that takes place every year in the wilds of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Every single year, the Kansas City Federal Reserve sponsors a big conference in Jackson Hole where all the central bankers in the world come together to talk about policy. So European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, Bank of Japan, Reserve Bank of Australia, on and on and on. They all get together, not necessarily to coordinate, but at least to listen to one another and figure out what each country or each region is considering. One of the things that will be at the top of their agenda is what is a realistic rate of inflation? Is 2% a legitimate target? Should it be 2.5? Should it be 3? And that matters because if we are looking at current inflation, probably around, in the US anyway, around 4.5, 4.4. So taking that down to 2 means cutting it by more than half. Taking it down to 3 is a whole lot less intimidating. And so some of the conversation is going to be, what should that goal be? Fourth point, foreign markets are slowing more quickly than our own. So if you are oriented toward the export market, that's a concern. Europe is arguably already in recession, particularly Germany. France is not far off. The UK will be hitting it later this year, not as severely as was anticipated last year. So even though the European Union is slinking into recession, the prediction last year was that it was going to be much worse than it is now. There's a certain amount of peak season reaction to these foreign markets, and this might also contribute to a little bit of reduction in inflation because these markets will be competing for our attention, and you may actually see some price declines for certain inputs, certain commodities, certain intermediate parts. The factors that are driving inflation still include the natural materials. You've been watching lumber prices bounce up and down. A lot of the metal prices have been all over the place. Oil has not been as affected as we thought it would be, given the role that Ukraine and Russia play in the oil markets. But average inflation has still been relatively high, even if you don't discount the wages, because the biggest driver of inflation right now has been wages. So the overall conclusion, hold on loosely. 2024 and 2025 look like years that we dig out of the doldrums, and we may not hit much of a doldrum in 2023. There's still a lot of conversation. The World Economic Forum was trying to get consensus among economists, which is a foolish venture at best. We all know the joke. If you put 5 economists in a room, you're going to get 5 different opinions, 6 if one's from Harvard. So the World Economic Forum said, but we think we can get consensus. We're going to poll over 100 economists and ask them the simple question, are we or are we not going to go into a recession in 2023 in the United States? What they got, predictably, 45% said, absolutely, we're going to go into a horrible recession. It's going to hit in second quarter, accelerate in third quarter, be even worse in fourth quarter, could last into next year and the year after. 45% said, nope, we're not going to have a recession at all. It's barely even going to be a downturn. Economy will slow, maybe grow at 1%, but not recession. And then 10% apparently didn't understand the question at all. So there you go. You've got data to support whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. 45% of us think the world's coming to an end. 45% of us are like, no big deal. And take your pick. So you can choose whichever economic approach you're in the mood for. And if you're like most people, it'll probably change 2 or 3 times through the course of the week. So a couple of observations just in general about what's going on with business and individuals for that matter. Companies and individuals react to taxation. They react to regulation. They react to anything that adds expense. You are getting a fairly obvious reallocation of corporate resources. People are moving to places where tax rates are lower, whether it's income tax rates, because there are a handful of states that don't even charge income tax, and corporate taxes. It is tending to force the migration towards the middle of the country and away from the coasts. And this has also been driven to a certain degree by cost of living. The cost of living is much lower in the middle of the country than it is on either coast. So people are leaving the California area to a degree, Oregon, Washington as well, even the Rocky Mountain states, and moving closer to the middle of the country, same thing coming out of the Northeast. So you get population shifts like this. The blue area is where populations are growing, and the sort of brown-orange area is where populations are declining. All along the West Coast, you have people leaving, particularly the urban areas. You're seeing a lot of exodus out of Seattle and Portland and the Bay Area and Southern California, LA, San Diego. And in some cases, they're not even going very far. And so you're seeing movement into Idaho. You're seeing movement into Nevada, into Arizona, into Utah. You also see quite a bit of growth in the middle of the country and in sort of the upper part of the Southeast, moving into Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, North Carolina, etc. Much of what's driving this is tax-based, regulatory-based, etc. But the other thing is often transportation, and that becomes the bigger issue the more that you start considering reshoring, companies moving back to the United States. Where are they going to move to? What's going to draw them to a particular area? Taxes will matter, regulatory attitudes will matter, but so will transportation. What's driving the middle of the country is the new rail corridor that's being created by the merger of Kansas City Southern Railroad, which has extensive penetration into Mexico, and Canadian Pacific. This is the two smallest Class 1 railroads combining, and that puts them into a competitive position against those like BNSF and Union Pacific and some of the others. So all up and down that I-35 corridor, you're seeing rapid expansion. It's really obvious in Texas, but also Oklahoma, going up into Missouri and Kansas, up into Iowa, up in South Dakota, up into Minnesota. So that whole corridor is becoming active as far as logistics and warehouse and all that kind of development. The banks have been moving away from certain types of corporate investment. They don't particularly want to be holding office buildings, so they're dumping those as fast as they can, even at a loss sometimes, just to get it off their books. What they are enthusiastic about: warehousing, logistics, supply chain, and to a significant degree, manufacturing. So we'll talk about some of those as we go as well. So I quickly mentioned the bank crisis, and again, I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but everybody is sensitive to what the banks are doing or intend to do. So in the middle of all of this crisis, the Fed launched a series of investigations. They put 4,700 regional banks under a watch, trying to figure out which one of them were vulnerable. 100 of the 4,700 were considered vulnerable. Of that 100, 10 were considered in trouble. So out of 4,700 regional banks, 4,690 of them were fine. Not exactly a crisis. You know, what you were dealing with was kind of overblown media response to things like Silicon Valley Bank. A lot of the members are California-based, and you were seeing a lot of that coverage. We were getting it all over the country, honestly. But the Silicon Valley Bank had been under scrutiny from the Fed for years. You know, their basic mode of operation was questioned, and even at one point referred to in an official Fed report as stupid. So, you know, you're kind of setting yourself up when you're doing something that others are roundly criticizing as inappropriate. Bank runs basically now are much too easy. They were not that simple. We all remember the photographs of people lined up at the bank and pounding on the door and where's my money? Now people just do it with their phone. Republic Bank lost something like 80% of its depositors in less than a minute. People just literally shoved their money with their phone. They didn't have to show up. They didn't have to pound on doors. They just did it electronically. So digital banking allows this bank run very, very quickly. And even though it reverses, which it did, many of these banks that lost depositors got them right back, but it upsets the economy in the meantime. So the commercial real estate area is probably the most risky for banks right now. The risk could be as high as 3 trillion, almost all of it concentrated in office buildings and retail. The St. Louis Financial Stress Index, still very low, much lower than it was in 2020. Little bit of a spike, and then that's about it. But the spike doesn't even take it up to levels that we saw in 2013, 2016. So at this point, we can kind of relax when it comes to bank crises. Credit tightening is the risk. This is what banks are being forced to do because the interest rates are getting higher. A little bit of a silver lining to this, though. The banks now have a little bit more margin to work with. They have been very, very risk averse for the last several years because they had no margin. Rates were zero. Now they're not. And banks now can make loans and have a little bit of wiggle room. They're also much more interested in loans that are being given for tangible purposes. If you're a manufacturer and you're borrowing money in order to buy a machine, to expand your physical presence, whatever it happens to be, those are collateralized purchases. So the bank feels a little more secure, saying if things go south, well, at least we have a machine that we've used as collateral. Banks are much less interested in kind of the intangible types of loans, like the guy that wants to open a coffee shop next to a Starbucks. Well, the bank is like, go away, that's a dumb idea, and we don't want to loan money to you. Consumer pressure is building. Banks are tightening, interest rates are going up. As far as interest rates are concerned, no big surprise there. We are becoming a little less dependent on credit cards. We're still seeing a lot of people using it for necessities, but it's almost exclusively in the income levels below 50,000 a year. Those who are above 100,000, especially above 200,000, they have curtailed their use of credit cards. They're using other types of savings, other types of spending mechanisms. Construction spending remains strong. Uncharacteristically, there's been a lot of concern, but manufacturing related construction is up 103% year over year. So normal is around 60 billion. We're hitting 189 billion. Same thing with housing. Housing has found a real split circumstance. Multifamily is up 23.6. Single family down 23.3. People are not interested at this stage in the single family option. Mortgages have gotten higher. There's reluctance to get into some of these things, but the multifamily demand is still very strong, particularly among millennials and Gen Z. So part of what's been skewing the construction sector, particularly for housing, is just that generational gap. Boomers, Gen Xers were the home buyers. They were very anxious to get into a home, particularly boomers. Millennials kind of like, well, I don't know that I want to start a family right away. I don't really know exactly where I want to live yet. I don't think I'm ready for a house. I think I'm perfectly fine in an apartment. What motivates people generally to get single family housing is having a family. And that's when all of a sudden all kinds of new things become motivators. What's the school district like? How safe is it in my neighborhood? Where are the other kids? Where are the playgrounds? The single guy living in an apartment goes, I don't care about any of that. It's like I just want an apartment. And how close am I to the fun capital of whatever city I'm in? So by the end of this year, you'll also have a lot of the infrastructure money starting to come in. That was allocated last year, but it takes almost a year to build through all of the environmental impact statements and the social impact statements and all the regulatory hoops that have to be jumped through. That has pretty much happened. So now you're starting to see that infrastructure money actually hit the ground. You also see a recovery of two sectors that were really decked in 2020. Lodging is up over 40% because in 2020 it virtually shut down. Hotel projects were abandoned. projects that had been finished were virtually abandoned. Travel and entertainment collapsed. Well, those are all coming back. And as a result, you're seeing a lot of activity in that area. There was a surge in job openings in April. That's not characteristic of imminent recession. You don't see an addition of job openings when people are worried about the future economy. New orders for durable goods accelerated in April, continued to do so in May. Another thing that doesn't usually coincide with recession, growing sectors throughout April into May: computers, electrical equipment and appliances, the automotive sector, defense sector. We've talked a lot about our support for Ukraine and all of the activity that's been revolving around that invasion. Well, we're supplying material, not people. And to be honest, well, if you're the manufacturer of these defense goods, using them up means that you're going to be making more. And we're benefiting quite dramatically from the expanse of spending in the defense sector because we're supplying that war. And as a result, areas that have been pretty dependent on the defense establishment, for example, Alabama, and areas in the Southeast, they're really seeing a lot of expansion based on these defense goods. Sectors that have been a little bit weak: communications equipment, mostly because it's coming down from a very high period in 21, and to a certain extent, fab metals. So this is a bit of an eye chart. I apologize, but it illustrates why we're challenged when it comes to predicting. If you had looked at this in 2022, you would have seen very, very anemic predictions for third and fourth quarter. You would have seen 0.4% maybe for third quarter, 0.4% maybe in fourth quarter. What we actually got was 2.6% growth in the third, 2.9% growth in the fourth. So we only missed it by 3 percentage points. I mean, hey, what's a few $1 trillion between friends? What happened was that we saw a lot of export activity in third quarter. We forget that we are a major manufacturing nation. We forget that we still account for 40% of the value of global manufacturing. We make very expensive things. We make road building equipment, and we make airplanes, and we make 92% of the railroad engines in the world. So what we sell is expensive, and it's bought by large companies and countries. And they wait for the dollar to be weaker so that it's a better deal. The dollar weakened in the third quarter, so we saw a lot more export. Fourth quarter was the consumer, and I've mentioned this before, but it's my favorite time of year, so I talk about it all the time. The American male saves Christmas every year the same way. We do not believe somehow that Christmas will be on the 25th. We're convinced it will be sometime in March, and we have plenty of time to shop, which we don't. And suddenly we realize Christmas is 2 days away, and we have not bought anything for anybody. The National Retail Federation has studied this, and they've discovered that men who buy the last 2 days before Christmas, 50% of what they purchase is purchased at a convenience store. So if you have been the proud recipient of a six-pack and a scratcher's ticket, you now know why. The males are frantically going to the store. Retailers know this. They know that men will not go more than 25 feet into a store, so they put all the junk they have left out front. We dutifully buy it. We give it to our loved ones. They give us that look and go back to the store to exchange it for something they really want, and it invariably costs 2 to 3 times what we spent on the original gift. So every year, the American male saves Christmas by sending legions of angry women back to the store to get even with their louts of a husband who bought them crud. Even though they've been dropping hints as to what they want for months, we ignored all the hints and we bought them weird stuff. So we do it every year. It happens like clockwork, and it happened last year, and we saw growth in the fourth quarter. So here we are in 2023. The prediction had been recession in quarter one, recession in quarter two. What we got first quarter was 1.1% growth, not breakneck, write home about growth, but growth. Q2 is likely to come in at 2%, not 1%. The latest data from the Atlanta Fed is suggesting that we're probably going to be around 2.5%, which is pretty close to our 30-year average. So how confident are we with that we're going to see recession in third, fourth quarter, first quarter of next year? To be honest, not very confident. There's an awful lot of analysts who say, we're heading for anemic growth. It's not necessarily going to collapse into a recessionary period. It's just going to feel slow compared to where we were in 21 and even parts of 22. Latest economic indicators would suggest that we're heading for a recession, but I always look at the LEI as compared to GDP. So if you go back to 2004, the LEI was saying, oh, it's going to be a banner year. We're going to grow at 10%. We didn't. We grew at less than half that. Then the LEI was saying, oh, God, the recession of 2008, we're going to drop 15 points. I mean, it's going to be the worst recession since the 30s. Well, it was a recession, but it was nowhere near that bad. It came down by about 3 points. So it rarely matches up. It's either higher or lower and doesn't always match up. The last time that it really kind of matched up was 2020, because that was something of an artificial recession and it happened suddenly. But look at it now. LEI is plunging, but the GDP is going up. So it's like, well, I don't know that we're headed for the Armageddon that the LEI is predicting. Here's the Atlanta GDP numbers when they were last being put together in May, predicting 2.2. Here is the critical problem, and this has been discussed at length. We've talked about it every time I've done one of these things. Talked about it the last time I was at one of these shows. The labor market is a mess. We have a labor shortage that's affecting, I would bet, every single business listening to this today. Cannot find people. The number one way that people are hiring is poaching each other, to the point that I'm watching trade shows where C-levels are no longer sending their operators. They're afraid they're going to lose them. If they send them to the show, someone's going to poach them and they'll be working for somebody else. This throws off the central banks. The central banks have a mantra. They basically say, look, we will raise rates until something breaks. Once we've broken something, then we think about lowering rates to fix what we broke. Well, they determine that they've broken the economy usually by looking at unemployment. When the unemployment rate goes up, then they then conclude we've done enough, therefore we can start to back away and even lower rates. The unemployment rate won't budge. It continues to stay very low. It's still under 4, which is abnormally low. Lots of reasons for the unemployment rate to remain as stubborn as it has. Lots of reasons for this lack of worker. The biggest concern is retirement. By 2030, the entire boomer generation will have reached retirement age, all of them, all 27 million. We have a population of 330 million. This is a significant chunk. I meant to say 76 million. I mean, it is nearly a quarter of the total population is the boomer generation. Now, boomers have fudged this for years because we never had lives and we just keep working. But you can do that into your 60s and 70s. You get into your 80s and all of a sudden it's like, I want to enjoy my golden weeks. I think I actually am going to quit. And you begin to see a real hemorrhage as far as the job market is concerned. Then you put in the influence of the gig economy. We know about this from Lyft and Uber and DoorDash and all that, but it gets a lot more complicated than that. There are many, many, many millions of people who are essentially working a gig type job. They're not formally really employed. Even when we try to count people in those jobs, we struggle. The household survey is one of the ways we determine unemployment. And it's simply going to a household and saying, is there anybody working in the household? The gig worker frequently says no. What do you mean no? You've got 13,000 trips on your Uber app. It's not a real job. Don't have a boss. Don't have to report in if I don't feel like driving. I just don't show up. It's not a real job. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. We don't know how to count them. So we honestly can't tell if they're unemployed or employed because they're in sort of another world of gig employment. That's throwing off the Fed's computation. They don't know if they've had the necessary impact on the economy. I mentioned that we act differently as consumers. We are not like other cultures. When other cultures get to a financially stressed period, they become frugal. They start saving. They start preparing for the worst. Our logic seems to be there's inflation. Things are going to get more expensive. I'd better buy now before they become more expensive. Furthermore, I might lose my job. And if I lose my job, then I can't afford to buy anything. So I'm going to buy now while I still have a job and the prices are low, so that if I do get laid off, I will at least have a big screen TV to watch. So retail sales have gone up. People are spending more money. They're above the trend line. So it's kind of a counterintuitive reaction to potential distress. But the average worker is fully aware that their employer is desperately trying to find people. So they do the math. They just sit there and say, well, my company has been trying to hire. They can't find anybody. They keep offering bonuses and more money, and they still can't find anybody. My job is as safe as it can be. I'm not going anywhere. I mean, they wouldn't dare fire me. They can't replace me, and they can't even find the new people they want. When people have that level of confidence, they spend. Savings rate is still low. Consumers are still working on paying down debt. Credit card rates have gone up. So they hit all-time highs in February, which is starting to keep people from using the credit card for day-to-day operations, which is generally a good thing. The Fed's still fighting inflation, obviously. It is looking at PCE rather than CPI. The Consumer Price Index comes out every month, tends to get a lot of press, but it's a little bit biased. It's based on some assumptions about an average family of 4 and how much they spend. The more accurate measure of inflation is this, TMPCE. TM trim mean just means they've done some statistical trimming so that it's more representative. But PCE is accurate, but it takes a while to collect because it's the actual spending that consumers have done. Therefore, it lags. The Fed is just now working with March data. We don't know what inflation was in April or May or June because we don't have that data. And the Fed is at this point looking at 3-month-old inflation. Has it come down since then? There are some indications that it might. Logistics costs are down. Oil prices are down. Some consumer prices are down. At the time that the Fed is dealing with, March of this year, remember the headlines. Eggs, food, everything outrageously expensive. Inflation had really hit the food sector. That's not true now. So we're dealing with a lot less food pressure and oil pressure than we were 3 months ago. Is that going to be reflected in the PCE numbers when we eventually get them for May and June? We don't know. Wages have been driving inflation for quite a while. They've been definitely the factor that's been pushing inflation harder and harder and harder. Now you're getting a little bit of convergence between wages and overall general inflation. Wages have sort of tapered off. They haven't fallen necessarily. They're still very much higher than they've been for the past decade, but other prices are beginning to come up as well. You hear a lot about the inverted curve, the 2-year bonds and the 10-year bonds. It's not so much that these indicate a recession, and they certainly don't cause one, but what you're seeing is a difference in bond buyer attitude. 2-year bond buyers react to interest rate spreads. They are a lot more excited when you start to see rates move, because that's what they bet on. So the 2-year bond market is much more immediate. The 10-year bond buyer is mostly interested in long-term growth. They're buying a bond with the assumption of growth. When the 10-year bond buyer sees interest rates going up, they assume that growth is going to slow, because that's what raising rates is supposed to do. So the demand for 10 years begins to diminish at the same time that demand for 2-year bonds goes up. And that's the inversion that you see. Doesn't mean that you're in a recession, doesn't cause a recession. It's kind of a reaction of the bond market to what they think is going to happen in the years and months to come. Spend a little bit of time on this, but not much. This is the thing that Armada does to track the overall manufacturing sector. So 3 takeaways from this chart. Number 1, you see all the growth. The blue line is what has happened, and we were still seeing pretty substantial growth and still see it into the next quarter. Then it begins to taper off, but it doesn't taper for long, and it begins to reverse, and you see a hook back up. We aren't that far off of that 20-year trend line at the current rate. And we start to head back that way in the not very distant future. So even if we are headed in a recessionary direction, it looks at this point to be short-lived, that it could be a 1 or 2 quarter phenomenon. You look at specific sectors and a lot of similarities into how these are performing. The automotive sector, lots of growth. That growth has been maintained. Even with the slowdown, it's still faster than it's been the last several years and above that long-term growth line. Same thing with aerospace. Aerospace has seen a lot of expansion, still going great guns as the airlines are trying to catch up with demand. If you look at machinery, a little more volatile. Transportation orders are the number 1 reason this has begun to flatten out. Other kinds of machinery, the demand is still there, and it has not flattened out dramatically. It's off that 10-year trend line, but not by much. And electrical equipment and appliances, a little bit of an inch up. The shortages of these are what's creating some of this decline. So the supply chain issue continues to be a problem. And as Adria was mentioning, if you go to Vegas, there'll be an entire panel talking about supply chain, because as I mentioned earlier, you guys are smack in the middle of industries. You know, you're dependent on how other industries are doing, and you're also dependent on the supply chain that is pushing into your industry. So you're dependent on the machines that are made, you're dependent on the raw materials. It's an unenviable position, because you're sort of out of control on either side. You can't really do much about your consumers, and you can't really do much about your inputs. So you're kind of like, well, I'm kind of getting clobbered from the one side because of supply chain, but then my consumer is having their own issues and they're not sure they can afford what I'm having to pay. So yeah, it's a great place to be. This may be the one slide that argues the most strongly against an imminent recession. Capital spending up to record levels, 75 billion. This chart goes all the way back to the 90s, and we've never been this high. A lot of this has been driven by robotics, technology, automation. If you can't find workers, you're going to have to use machines, and that's largely what's been driving this kind of spending. But as long as the spending is this high, companies don't engage in heavy CapEx if they're anticipating a decline. Now, it's flattened out just recently, but it's still very high. It's still up year over year. Global manufacturing, we are still in respectable territory. This is the Purchasing Managers Index. I like the PMI because purchasing managers don't know enough to lie. If you ask a purchasing manager, are you buying more or less lumber? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make. Somebody told me to buy more lumber and we're out of toilet paper. I'm the purchasing manager, man. I don't know why I do anything. Somebody tells me to buy something and I go find a good price. So it's 100% accurate. They're either buying more, buying less, or buying the same. If the index is above 50, it's growth. If it's under 50, it's contraction. The US was at 50.2, barely into growth. We dropped back to 48.4. Not good, but we don't really worry about the PMI numbers until you get into the mid 40s or low 40s. And we're in good company. 19 countries now have sectors in contraction. India is the fastest growing country on this list. There's also Russia, but that's a lie. The organization that submitted their first round of data had numbers in the 30s, which is very bad. That disappeared and was replaced by a new set of data that said they were in their 50s. And the people who submitted the first round of data vanished. So, moral of the story is, do not say something that Vladimir Putin does not want you to say. Otherwise, you will find a new career someplace in Siberia. Growth across the global economy isn't awful. It's way down from where we were in 21, as one would expect it to be, but it's not all that far off from what we had prior to the decline. So if you look at the numbers, well, they're pretty reminiscent of 2019 and 2018. There are obviously some examples that are much different, but you look at sort of the exceptions to the rule. Look at India's growth. I mean, they're setting the world on fire, and that's a good sign as we try to find ways to limit our exposure to China. International issues, not really a lot of time to go into this in detail, but you're already dealing with recession in Europe, particularly in Germany. Inflation globally has peaked, starts to come down, but it's mostly been energy related. The Ukraine war grinds on, and the latest episode in Russia is just an example of how miscalculation has dogged the Russians from day one. The Russians even have a word for this kind of aborted coup. They call it Pugachevщина, and it's a reference back to the Pugachev revolts back in the 1800s. They're doomed from the start, but they shake up the government. And what this does to Putin's status, hard to tell, but it has certainly accelerated the deterioration of morale in Russia. Don't have the time to go into great detail, but just a couple of stories that illustrate what's troubling the Russian army. There were 3 Russian tanks that were blown up by a drone. That's not unusual. Drones are supposed to do this, but in this case, it was a $50 Radio Shack drone that a 13-year-old Ukrainian girl had attached dynamite to, lit the fuse, flew the drone into the tanks, blew them up because they were carrying fuel. She then proceeded to scamper home, and the best part of it all, it was her brother's drone. Story number 2. The Ukrainians have a few of these West German Leopard tanks now. So here come the Russians over the hill with their T-34s, World War II vintage tanks. The crews of the Leopard tanks, I saw the video, which was distributed by the U.S. military at one of their briefings. The crew is sitting outside the tank in lawn chairs, drinking beer, and handing beers into the gunner, who is the only one in the tank. And periodically you see a beer can fly out of the tank and another one comes in. The gunner is systematically picking off the T-34s. And at one point you hear one of the crew say, "Do they not know we can fire 4 times further than them?" So the Russians weren't even in range. They couldn't fight back if they wanted to. And the Ukrainians were just picking them off one after the other, destroyed 20 of them before the Russians figured out that they couldn't even get close enough to attack. So a lot of problems. India's on a fast growth pace, getting much closer to the US. Narendra Modi, their prime minister, was here about a week ago. China struggling to get back to its economic growth pace, probably will not make their goal of 5% growth this year. Japan is worried about manufacturing demand starting to decline. They're seeing some real inflation for the first time in really the last 20 years for Japan. Mexico has been benefiting from all that reshoring. There's nearly as much nearshoring going on as there is reshoring. Most of Latin America, however, is in distress, particularly Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and you still get a reevaluation of deglobalization. Are we really deglobalizing? To a point, yes, we are. We're seeing a lot more activity coming back to the United States. The appeal for producing overseas is limited. It's not going away. There's going to continue to be global trade, but it is not sort of the overwhelming driver that it has been in past years. Material price is still historically high as far as construction is concerned. It's come down a little bit from the post-pandemic peak. The oil sector is becoming more US focused. We're the world's biggest producer, we're the world's biggest exporter. Recently, Saudi Arabia announced that it was going to cut production. Generally, that's expected to trigger high oil prices. It didn't because, well, we produce our own oil. We're up at about 14 to 16 million barrels a day. We consume 20 million barrels a day. That which we don't produce ourselves, we get from Canada and Mexico. So we're North American independent. We don't buy much at all from the Middle East or North Africa anymore, and we're capable of producing even more than we are. Upshot is crude prices in the 70s, diesel down by over $1, gasoline prices down by nearly $1. A lot of the economy is struggling at the moment because it's overstocked. 63% remains overstocked. A lot of inventory build, reacting to the supply chain. People didn't want to get caught short in the future, but now they have too much inventory, and that's affecting the reorder cycle. And then finally, I really am coming to the end of this. We have seen an improvement in logistics costs. We had 14 loads for every truck at the beginning of last year. It's now down to 4 loads per every truck because last year we saw 65,000 new trucking companies. Has to be one of the easiest industries to get into. If you suddenly decide that woodworking is no longer for me, I want to be a trucker. What do I need? A truck and a CDL. And if you've got those two things, by golly, you're a trucker. And so a lot of people get into the industry, they come out of it as fast as they went in, but 65,000 new trucking companies allowed prices to come back to more normal levels. So finally, I'm going to shut up like 8 seconds before my time is up. This is the graph that simplifies it all. So I wanted to put everything that's going on in the world economy into one graph. So, it's just, there it is, all the answers you could possibly need. It's all right there. So with that, I'm going to hush. Adria will talk to you more about what's happening in Vegas, where you can actually see me live and determine how much of what I just told you changed between now and July.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuehl. As always, that was super informative and entertaining. I will forgive you for encouraging people to go into trucking instead of woodworking, but you are absolutely right. Our friends in trucking have such severe workforce needs, and of course they impact all of us. So
it can be a hobby. They can do it for a hobby.
Yeah, there we go. Weekend stuff. So Dr. Kuehl mentioned the flagship report. I want to make sure you're aware. AWFS offers the Monday edition of the flagship report to our member companies. If you are not receiving the flagship report in your inbox, click on this QR code or go to this link right here, and you will be subscribed. And then Dr. Kuehl and his team publish it 3 times a week. So if you love it so much and you want it more frequently, then you can work with them to get additional copies.
Very good.
Right.
And if you have questions later, since I generally suck all the air out of the room, feel free to send me an email with any questions that you have. And I promise you that I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public.
Thank you. Awesome. And just a reminder again, I want to make sure that everyone's registered and ready to be at the AWFS Fair next month. 1 month from right now. Dr. Kuehl will be joining us. His session will be on July 27th, which is Thursday at 12 noon. It's at the AWFS Fair live stage, and it is free to all registered AWFS Fair attendees and exhibitors. So you do not need to register specifically for that session or pay or anything like that. Just show up at the show floor stage, which is booth 4780, and you can hear Dr. Kuehl affirm or correct the forecasting that he shared with us today. And as
Yep,
he also
and just be aware that that forecast is a bargain at twice the price of free. So.
There we go. Super deal. And he also mentioned the supply chain session. So that's immediately following his session. That's going to be a great panel session with some industry professionals that many of you will know. And so again, that's at the AWFS Fair Live show floor stage right after Dr. Kuehl's session. So we hope you join us for that as well. If you're not yet registered, early bird registration is ending soon. So go ahead and get signed up for the show now and go to awfsfair.org to learn more about the show, see all of the programming and schedules, and then get registered. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. I think you did address the questions that we received in advance. And again, you can always reach out to Dr. Kuehl directly to ask him anything, or you always welcome to email me. This is my email address, adria@awfs.org. If you could please complete this brief survey, click on this QR code or this link for SurveyMonkey, just so that we can make sure that we're meeting your needs and interests with these webinars and serving our members and the industry well. So thank you all again so much for joining us today. We hope you found this informative and hope to see you next month at the show. Have a wonderful day.
Very good. See you later.
Thank you.